People can take their seats. So welcome, I'm Richard Howitt, I'm the European Parliament Rapporteur on Corporate Social Responsibility, and I've been involved on behalf of Europe throughout the genesis of the UN Guiding Principles, and I'm very proud that the Working Group and the Office of the High Commissioner have asked me to moderate this afternoon's debate on transparency and reporting, something that is very close to my heart. On the panel, you will be listening to a really relevant and superstar collection of speakers who are going to address us. They say about America that it doesn't really believe in doing too much on all this stuff, and you know, they're against reporting. And then you look at what they're doing on Dodd-Frank on conflict minerals, on disclosure of payments to governments, on the Security and Exchange Commission interpretive guidance on climate change, on mandatory disclosure of new investments, on religious freedom, on child labour. And actually they've got quite a lot of reporting requirements. So why is it you've got a reputation for not believing in reporting, but actually you do? We're going to be hearing about that from the Deputy Assistant of State from the State Department, Scott Busby. We're then going to be hearing from the Friends of Paragraph 47. I can see you're all falling off your seats at the excitement, but the truth is that at the UN Summit for Sustainable Development, Rio Plus 20, a year and a little ago, some governments in the UN said, no, we're going to make transparent sustainability reporting our mission within the UN, for ourselves and our mission within the UN. And those four governments have been joined by two others, one of which is the government of Colombia, and Andrea on my left is going to be talking about what those governments are doing in the UN system to promote a reporting requirement. We're then going to hear from the world's leading methodology for reporting by companies, nearly 15 years old, used by at least 6,000 companies, and with a formal memorandum of understanding to incorporate cooperation with the UN Guiding Principles and Human Rights. And the Deputy Director of the Global Reporting Initiative, Teresa, is going to be speaking next. We will then move on to someone who worked for John Ruggie throughout his mandate and is now the president of the non-profit that is working with many businesses and many in governments worldwide on implementation of the guiding principles, but specifically working on a project I hope she'll talk to us about on human rights indicators in reporting with the accountancy company Mehra, and that's Caroline Rees. And then we're going to be getting a citizen NGO response from Amol Mehra, from the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable. And his coalition of NGOs does span environment, human rights, development, in a way that we all say we want, because these shouldn't be in silos, they shouldn't be in boxes. And the NGOs have got their act together to make sure that you're doing that, and he's going to listen to the debates and respond from the NGO point of view. I'm going to say three things very briefly in introduction. Number one, transparency works. Right? If we want something that is going to change business behaviour, reward the best, try and stop the worst, transparency, in my view, is the key thing to do it. And that early 20th century US Supreme Court judge, William Douglas, who said, sunlight is the best disinfectant, said something that is still true today in the 21st century. Number two, we're not in silos. This doesn't have to be a burden. It doesn't have to be against the financial interest of the company. I want companies to speak out who report or want to report in this session, and I'll be giving you priority because your voice is so important to us. And as someone who's associated with Teresa and the GRI and the International Integrated Reporting Council, you know, they are working within a 10-year period to make integrating reporting, social, environmental and human rights the norm. And it's exciting, it's happening now. And what they say is that there are 6 capitals: financial capital, yes, but also natural capital, the environment, also human capital, the relationships that we have with people, also intellectual capital and manufactured capital. And this is about saying that financial capital does need to get a rate of return, but if we deplete the other capitals, the ability to do that is diminished. And if we think about it in this is actually something that is very business friendly as well. And the third thing I'll say is that in my own region of the world, the European Union, I've argued for, and we're very close to getting, after a very long period, a non-financial reporting law, which is going to say that companies in their annual reports in an integrated way are going to be required to report on their social, environmental and human rights, explicitly human rights policies, results and risks. It's a very important landmark law. It may well be agreed by April next year, and I hope if we do it that it can be a very major contribution to the whole debates that are being had worldwide about human rights reporting by companies. Having said that, Europe's taking one way. In the United States, I'm not saying it's a different way, it's complementary, and I'm really delighted that Scott Busby, the Assistant Secretary of State from the State Department, acting it says, but absolutely welcome here, and Scott is going to lead our discussions.
Thank you, Richard. Well, with that type of introduction, I fear that I can only disappoint, but I'll do my best to live up to your billing, Richard. Thank you for inviting us here today to speak on this important issue of effective human rights reporting when it comes to business and human rights. We believe, along with many of you in this room, that knowing and showing business respect for human rights is a critical component of the implementation of the UN guiding principles. And consistent with that belief, we try to work closely with businesses to provide information, support, and guidance that will help businesses respect human rights throughout their operations and encourage them to communicate transparently about how they do so. In some instances, the U.S. government supports these efforts by encouraging human rights-related reporting through various U.S. laws and regulations, many of which Richard has already referred to. I want to talk to you today about two of those reporting requirements, relatively new reporting requirements. The first is some requirements we recently put in place with regards to Myanmar, and the second regards something we call the Dodd-Frank Act, which many of you have heard about regarding reporting related to so-called conflict minerals. Let me begin with the Myanmar reporting requirements. Last year, with the reforms that were being undertaken in Myanmar, there was considerable pressure on us to lift some of the comprehensive sanctions we had in place vis-a-vis Myanmar. And we did decide to lift some of those sanctions, but in conjunction with the lifting of those sanctions, we decided that it would be very important to simultaneously put in place new reporting requirements to ensure that new business investment in Myanmar contributed to the reform efforts there rather than detract from them. We innovated in this regard and used some of our existing legal authorities to develop a set of reporting requirements regarding U.S. persons, both individuals and businesses, who make new investments in Myanmar. Because many companies are entering this market for the first time, they're going to have to be doing all sorts of things that they haven't done before: buying land, hiring workers, sourcing materials, making security arrangements, entering into contracts, all of the things that business activity requires. And the U.S. government believes strongly that the way in which these things get done matters a great deal. If issues related to human rights, corruption, environmental impact, among others, are not appropriately considered upfront, irresponsible investment can exacerbate, we believe, existing vulnerabilities and ultimately undermine the reform effort. Conversely, we believe that responsible investment can reinforce the existing reform process in Myanmar by playing a positive role in upholding the rule of law, spurring economic development, and demonstrating to the people of Myanmar that democratic reforms can pay both political and economic dividends. Moreover, being transparent about how business is conducted promotes economic inclusion, and in our view, empowers civil society to feel a sense of ownership regarding the development around their communities. So what do these reporting requirements entail? There are two components to these requirements. The first is a notification requirement, and the second is a due diligence requirement. First, the notification requirement requires any U.S. person that has undertaken a new investment agreement with the Myanmar Oil and Gas Enterprise, the acronym there is MOGE, M-O-G-E, to notify the U.S. State Department in writing of such new investment. So it's simply a notification requirement, but the idea is, given the problems that there have been in the past with this enterprise, if and when a company notifies us that they are engaging with this enterprise, we then can engage informally in a discussion with the investing entity about the challenges they're likely to face in dealing with this new enterprise. The second requirement pertains to U.S. persons, again, both individuals and companies, who make new investments in Myanmar of $500,000 or more. The requirement requires them to submit an annual report detailing certain types of information regarding their investment. And that includes information related to procedures and programs involving respect for human rights, worker rights, anti-corruption, and environmental due diligence policies and procedures. To address concerns regarding any sensitive information involving these companies' investments, U.S. persons are to submit a public report and a U.S. government report. That is to say, if there are things that the company feels should not be put into the public domain, they can share that information only with the U.S. government and not have it be part of their public report. These reporting requirements were directly inspired by the UN guiding principles, and that fact is made clear in those requirements. We have made available copies of those reporting requirements. I guess will be on a table outside, as well as a fact sheet about the requirements and some frequently asked questions about those requirements, which were issued earlier this year. Our hope is to use these reports to both advise businesses about how to engage in responsible investment in Myanmar, and also to facilitate a public dialogue with many of you, about how these businesses are going about their activities. We have received 5 reports to date, several of them from passive investors, so they're not as robust reports as we anticipated under our reporting requirements, but we are expecting more soon, and we'll be very interested to hear from you about those. Secondly, let me just briefly touch on the Dodd-Frank Act, which was passed several years ago. Regulations have been issued by the Security and Exchange Commission of the U.S. government in August of 2012 that require companies to file reports with the SEC to disclose to the U.S. government and the world those companies' activities regarding the use of tin, tantalum, and tungsten that is necessary to the functionality or production of a product manufactured by that company or contracted by that company, and to report on whether or not those minerals have funded conflict in the African Great Lakes region. I won't talk more about these here. These were done consistent with the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible supply chain of minerals from conflict-afflicted regions. We can get more into those, into that requirement in the discussion. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you.
Both of those issues, Myanmar, Burma, and the conflict minerals, I know there will be a wealth of expertise in the room that I'm sure there will be questions, and thank you for introducing them to us. So, the Government of Colombia, Andrea Pradilla, but speaking on behalf of the several governments dealing with the paragraph 47. Andrea.
Thank you, Richard. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here sharing with you what the Group of Friends is and what we do. I understand for most of you it might be new, and we know we're the newest group, but I promise you we are a very interesting initiative and that it's looking for candidates and friends that want to support it, so please bear with me for these 6.5 minutes. The Group of Friends of Paragraph 47 is actually a government-led initiative that was formed initially by Brazil, Denmark, France, and South Africa, pioneers in the promotion of corporate sustainability reporting through either policy or regulation or both. And it was created in June 2012 during the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, also known as Rio+20. What for? It was created in order to advance the recommendations put forward under paragraph 47 of the outcome document, The Future We Want. Since then, the governments of Austria, Colombia, Norway, and Switzerland have joined the group, and as of last week, we're delighted to announce that the government of Chile has become the newest member to join our ranks. The United Nations Environment Program and the Global Reporting Initiative support the group in a secretary capacity. So what is it that we do, and what do we believe in? The group members share the belief that corporate transparency and accountability are key elements of a well-functioning market economy, and that they enhance the private sector's contribution to sustainable development. Our charter recognizes that governments have a prime
The interpreters would like to ask the speaker to please slow down if possible.
behavior in this regard. In order to create enabling conditions for this, the group aims to further the promotion of corporate sustainability reporting globally by working with governments and relevant stakeholders to develop and exchange best practice models for policy and guidance in this area. We do know that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to promoting sustainability reporting. What matters for this group is that governments choose the most relevant policy tools applicable to their culture and their jurisdiction.
Just slightly slow down for the interpretation.
Okay. I have to slow down now. The group's work with other governments and relevant stakeholders will focus on sustainability reporting in the financial sector, sustainability reporting by state-owned enterprises and public agencies, case studies of national sustainability reporting public policy as a tool for sharing best practices and experience with other governments, as well as business and human rights reporting in line with the UN guiding principles. A key objective of the group is to maintain and promote the agenda of sustainability reporting at the international level. And in this context, the group is exploring opportunities to engage in discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2015 development agenda. It is also why it is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to actively engage in this panel discussion on effective human rights reporting on behalf of the Group of Friends. Allow me to briefly share with you some of the examples of best practice of human rights reporting in our member countries. I'll focus especially on France, Denmark, Norway, and Colombia. France was actually the first country worldwide to introduce mandatory extra-financial reporting on a comply-or-explain basis in 2001. Originally applying to listed companies only, coverage was extended in 2010 to include any company with a turnover of or assets of over 100 million euros and more than 500 employees. These companies are required to publish a range of information concerning the integration of human and social rights, environmental protections, and other measures in favor of sustainable development. The legislation was complemented in June 2011, just after the adoption of the UN Guiding Principles, by a law which widened the scope of reporting to measures taken against discrimination and promoting gender diversity. Initial results are positive. According to a 2013 Deloitte study, 88% of France's 120 largest listed companies have reported measures taken against discrimination. 82% on international social rights, and 76% on other measures in favor of human rights. Sustainability reporting on a complain or explain basis has also been mandatory in Denmark since 2009 for listed and state-owned companies and for large companies. As of 1st of January of this year, these companies are also obliged to specifically report on their policies, activities, and results of measures taken in favor of human rights. Danish frontrunners in CSR are, for example, in the process of considering how to set up operational level grievance mechanisms to ensure access to remedy for victims. In terms of Norway, the government is in the process of drawing up its national action plan to implement the UN guiding principles, outlining how all Norwegian ministries and government institutions that interact with the private sector will ensure that business fulfill their responsibility to respect human rights. The Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is training its diplomats in corporate social responsibility and informing them about the UN guiding principles and how those international commitments apply to Norwegian enterprises, activities abroad, and activities at home, of course. The ministry is also producing guidelines on topics such as indigenous people's rights, which I would invite you to get to know better. In the case of Colombia, the government is also in the process of drawing up its public policy on human rights and its white paper on CSR, which will also have a strong focus on sustainability reporting in human rights. We have some good examples from our private sector with regards to the voluntary principles and what they've done when it comes to reporting in human rights. We also have sectorial efforts to have public agencies report on their human rights impacts. Colombia has also adhered to the OECD due diligence in the mining sector tool, which you were just mentioning, and that's one of the ways in which we promote transparency and accountability. Before I conclude, I'd like to draw your attention to a group of friends publication called Frequently Asked Questions on Corporate Sustainability Reporting, which is a great tool. This will be of interest to any government or stakeholder that's looking to find out more about corporate sustainability reporting and our agenda. It's available to be downloaded from the UNEP website, so feel free to visit and download it. And finally, please allow me to take this opportunity to underline that we're actively seeking the engagement of additional like-minded governments in the group of Friends of Paragraphs. So take that as an invitation if you feel like you're a like-minded country. And also, we welcome the opportunity to participate in constructive dialogue with other stakeholders willing to join our efforts. Thank you.
So the friends are looking for some more friends.
Exactly.
That's someone who's genuinely one of my friends, Teresa Fogelberg, Deputy Chief Executive of the Global Reporting Initiative.
Thank you very much, Richard Howard. Thank you very much, Chair. We are listening to the power of transparency through the power of regulation with examples of the US, Denmark, France, Norway, and South Africa. And we heard the example of the political leadership when governments get together, political leaders. And I'm also proud to salute Marine de Carnet, who is the president of the group of friends representing France. Very happy to have you here amongst us today. So it is a great honor for me to speak here on behalf of the Global Reporting Initiative at this second annual forum on business and human rights. The Global Reporting Initiative is an international independent organization with a multi-stakeholder governance and a due process, which is led by a due process. And we have developed over the last 15 years the de facto global standard on sustainability reporting, containing principles and standard disclosure items on social, environmental, human rights, governments and government's performance and results. And it is rooted on all the UN conventions. Our global headquarters is based in Amsterdam, and we have offices now in 8 locations throughout the world, and soon to open our new office in Bogota, in Colombia. I will speak in my 6 remaining minutes about the 2 global movements which actually are converging here today in this panel. That's the global movement of sustainability reporting and the global movement of human rights through the UN guiding principles, but also the forum, the importance, convening power of this forum, bringing together almost 2,000 people from all these stakeholders. And I would like to say Richard Howitt is maybe the best chair of this session because he is the champion and the bridge between these two movements on reporting and on human guiding principles, human rights. And it was interesting, the previous session actually questioned, should human rights impact studies, should human rights endeavors by companies, should it be published or not? And I think the fact that we have this session is already an answer to that question. Sustainability reporting indeed is a global movement that started 15 years ago when companies found it very normal that there was only financial information available in the public, and that topics like transparency, accountability were seen as civil society outcries. Now, 15 years later, almost 100% of the largest companies, the 250 largest companies in the world, annually publish reports, sustainability reports, either standalone or as part of their own general annual report on their environmental, social, and human rights performance. Today, beyond those large global companies, between 3,000 and 4,000 companies, state-owned companies, private companies, family companies, listed companies, they all disclose annual information pertaining on these topics and also on human rights performance. So that is a huge source from which you all can tap. So this means two things, that we have this knowledge of around 2,000 to 3,000 companies that have issued information on human rights, and maybe they are not even aware that they are indirectly using the human rights guiding principles. I'll come back to that in a minute. And so in a way, we can tap into those resources. What we also see is an increase in policy, and we just heard the example of the United States. And but I think that Andrea Pradilla was also mentioning other countries. I think a very good example is Denmark, where they have this report or explain approach, meaning that it is relatively flexible. Companies can report on those topics that are material to them, but at the same time the Danish government has combined it with the obligation to at least to report on human rights performance. And as we speak today, the European Union is at a very critical political phase, because we hope that within the next 6 months there will be a regulation passed through the company law of all the EU member states, 28 member states, which will make it mandatory for large companies to report on their environmental, social, but also on their human rights performance, and explicitly asking for a reference to the UN guiding principles, amongst others. So this is very politically also a very exciting moment. A few words about the GRI guidelines. We have just launched the 4th generation. The 3rd generation, point 1, already had aspects of protect, respect, and the remedy framework. But when we launched G4 in May of this year, the UN guiding principles became fully embedded into the GRI guidelines. And you could say the key focus of G4 is the concept of materiality. What matters most and what is most material to these companies, but also to their stakeholders. So some people say, well, if companies can choose what is material, would they not forget about human rights? Well, we think that it will be very hard for a huge multinational enterprise to look itself in the mirror and to ask itself, is human rights material to me, or is it not material to me? Because they have to describe that in their report. And also, government policy and regulation will help them to make it even more, you could say, automatically material. The G4 guidelines of GRI contain specific indicators on human rights, but several of their other content or their other disclosure standards have human rights related content, such as gender equality, procurement practices, supply chain, grievance mechanisms, corruption issues, and governance. So in that sense, you could say it is much broader than only the so-called human rights indicators. So you could say that the interlinkage, and this will be my concluding words, the interlinkage between the UN Guiding Principle and GRI works two ways. On the one hand, a company that is interested to work with the UN Guiding Principles can look at G4, use it to choose the material topics within the G4 guidelines and to manage and to disclose that information. And automatically it will start working with concepts that come directly from the UN Guiding Principles, such as due diligence, reporting boundaries, and materiality. So that will help those companies. The other way around, those companies that are already using the GRI guidelines, you could say through the materiality focus, they will arrive at the topic of human rights and therefore start reporting on the guidelines. So we are concretely helping this interlinkage in two ways. On the one hand, we are offering the working group guidance, technical guidance and materials to explain how this interlinkage works. And on the other hand, we had the pleasure to close a collaboration, or to start a collaboration, and formally sign a collaboration 2 days ago with RAFI, the Reporting and Assurance Framework, so that, and Caroline Rees will be talking about it in a minute, so the instrument of RAFI that will be developed and GRI is fully dovetailed and mainstreamed. So we are very optimistic. We think that sustainability reporting presents a huge opportunity for all of us in the room, because it will drive improvements in human rights standards, and it will also be help to ensure that the UN Guiding Principles will be implemented by companies. So we do think that these two worlds, the sustainability reporting world and the business and human rights forum and the guiding principles together, are an unstoppable global movement, backed up by government regulation, support practices by many, many companies. And I think next year, let's bring some companies here behind the table so they can testify how they have worked and how they have used it. Thank you.
Thank you. Teresa is unstoppable herself, as you saw, but what you said was really very helpful. Thank you so much. And in terms of what you said about interlinkage, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of Aron Overkamp from the Dutch government, who's the chair of the working group in the OECD, who's responsible for the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprise. And the update he steered through, again, had a chapter on the guiding principles, have requirements about transparency. So it's another very good example of that interlinkage. Now, two commentators. I've known Caroline for a lot of years. I've never known you as a commentator. But Caroline, would you like to respond to what you've heard?
Thank you very much, Richard, and it's a real pleasure to be here today, have the opportunity of this discussion and be on the panel with such great speakers and such great information coming into the domain here. I mean, I think we've heard a lot on the panel about the growing market drivers, if I can put it that way, for more reporting on human rights, on how companies meet their responsibility to respect human rights, regulatory drivers, stock exchange drivers. Of course, there are also investor drivers, stakeholder drivers, and the drivers from within companies themselves that are leading inevitably and inexorably to more and more reporting in this space. And that's a trend we're going to see continue and grow. There can be no doubt. Inevitably, looking at it from the perspective of an organization like SHIFT that looks at implementation of the guidelines in all stakeholder contexts, an inevitable question that comes to mind is as this reporting proliferates, do we have an idea of what good looks like? Now, that's not to say in any regard that there's a sort of a one-size-fits-all proposition. That would clearly be absurd, but equally it's not to say that this is an endlessly elastic proposition where really it's just whatever anyone chooses on a particular day of a particular year. In other words, how do we answer the question of what kinds of information, when it comes to human rights, is it most meaningful for companies to report on in terms of the readers of the report, and what kinds of information is it viable for companies to report, and where are the convergence of those two, and how do we drive more convergence of the two? Add to that an additional question that as companies report more, and as some of those companies choose to seek assurance of their reports, which again is inevitably starting to happen and will continue to happen, what actually makes for good assurance of those reports. Again, a field where there's a lot of questions as to what good looks like. And that really is the set of questions that underlie the initiative that we have been involved with to look at the development of reporting and assurance frameworks related specifically to the responsibility to respect human rights. Now, the proposition of this initiative is fairly simple, and the process to achieve it is exceptionally challenging. So the proposition is one of developing two frameworks, public domain frameworks, usable by whomever, developed through a process of broad consultation so that we hope they will be widely seen as valid and viable and worthwhile. That help indeed to give guidance to companies on what good would look like when they report on their responsibility to respect human rights, and would give guidance to assurance providers on assurance of the same. Now, we're working in this project with two project partners, and Richard, you mentioned this at the beginning. Mazar, we're a non-profit in the business and human rights field. Mazar is an auditing and assurance firm, and I'm delighted that James Coleman is here in the room. And the ASEAN Human Rights Resource Centre as well, Michelle Staggs-Kelsel also with us, who are helping us also, particularly in the ASEAN region, to draw out consultations and experience from all stakeholders around this. But suffice to say that each of us and organisations have an angle of a part of expertise in the fields we work in, but there are a great many other organisations in our own fields with critical expertise, and there are many organisations with other expertise that is crucial to an exercise like this. So the project is really one where we're seeing ourselves as facilitating conversations to try and work out where there are ideas about convergence, or where is there convergence of ideas around this. How can we start to crystallize that, play it back, rediscuss it, and iteratively through this process hopefully move forward to the kinds of products that can achieve the aims identified. So most recently we've had 6 consultations on 4 continents in the last 10 weeks, which built on a host of prior conversations, submissions we'd received, ranging from the supportive to the critical, with all manner of important issues raised across that range. It suffice to say it's very early stages, but it's been fascinating in that process to have both extremely rich discussions and also some really interesting areas of convergence. And I hope as we move forward we can start to crystallize and build on that. Now, every aspect of this is going to be public, or already public domain documents on the website of the Human Rights Resource Centre for ASEAN and the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. And the reports of these consultations will be out in the next 3 or 4 weeks as well to build on that. I'll just add one final point, which is a key message to us right from the beginning has been that if indeed this is to add value, and the proof will be in the pudding, but if this is to add value, it has to dovetail with and fit with the landscape, right? This isn't a green field, and we've already heard a host of stuff about what is already happening, from reporting initiatives through to sector-specific, more granular initiatives as well. So this has to fit with that, avoid undermining other things that can add to and enrich the space, but make sense also for companies who are ultimately the people that will work with this. And it's in that context that we've been so delighted as a project team to form this MOU with the Global Reporting Initiative to help ensure that we have a collaboration to make sure that for reporting companies, as they use the G4, that they can then also look to this additional framework that will sit with that sensibly and be a logical extension of that for those wanting to dig in further. Thank you.
I particularly liked your question, what does good what do good looks look like, right? Because this is now officially the best looking panel of the entire forum. How to do that and uphold one's equality credentials. I did it. Amol.
That's a lovely way to segue into my presentation. Thanks for the invitation to participate on this panel, and thanks to the panelists for their remarks. As Richard mentioned at the beginning, I'm the director of the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, and we're a coalition of leading human rights, development, labor, and environmental organizations working on business and human rights policy. So we've come to the issue of reporting after knowing that knowing and showing is just perhaps not something that we can leave up to be defined by others. The human rights issues at play need to be properly considered, and the approach to developing reporting must factor into the fact that this is, in the end, about addressing and mitigating and preventing human rights harms from occurring. So whereas the sustainability reporting world has generally evolved as what one may call more of a marketing exercise, the human rights reporting landscape must be different, and it must be treated and recognized as different. So our work on this issue includes a recent publication called Knowing and Showing. This report argues that human rights-related information is material for regulation, for securities regulation, and also unpacks the various ways that in the U.S. context, existing securities laws can be used to require disclosure on human rights due diligence, both process and impacts. So this report unpacks the securities context in the U.S., as I mentioned, and shows that no new requirements need to be built in order for us to see meaningful reporting. It also details the various different initiatives in this space. On the panel today, we have the Global Reporting Initiative, but in the U.S. context, there's also the SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. There's also the IRC, which we mentioned. So there are a number of different initiatives out there, and I think it's important to recognize that a number of them are now turning their eye towards human rights. So I'll make my remarks sort of generally on two themes based on the panelists' presentations today. And I think these highlight what the next steps need to be in order for human rights reporting to be meaningful for the end user, which is the consumer of the report, but also for the communities that are impacted in their daily lives by the activities of corporations. So one, on governments. Governments need to regulate in this space. Governments need to ensure that human rights reporting is something that is regulatory and not sort of encouraged, but that there is some consistency with which companies address this issue. This is the way that we can ensure that the Pillar 2, the responsibility to respect, and the concept of human rights due diligence actually has meaning. So I would encourage governments in the room to look at within their existing U.S. securities or the securities regimes or other means of ensuring reporting as a way to sort of capture and regulate in this space. Secondly, governments should be encouraged to develop new and novel frameworks. Kudos to and congratulations to the U.S. government for the reporting requirements on Burma. And again, an example which civil society had been advocating for, an example of innovative regulation on human rights reporting. But this is not enough. Governments need to enforce requirements on reporting. So where reporting fails is when the act of reporting is complete and it's incomplete or it doesn't address the entire requirements that were laid out. So when governments regulate in this space, they must make sure that there's follow-through to ensure active enforcement of the regulation. And I'll also mention that reporting itself should not be treated as a substitute for remedy. So the absence of the need for effective judicial remedy is paramount here. Reporting provides, we believe, a way for companies to prescriptively look down the line and think about their operations, and also to gain some valuable feedback about how their operations are structured and what steps they can take to alter their operations in order to prevent and remedy human rights-related impacts. The next thing I want to mention here is for companies. Companies need to practice what they preach. If transparency is the word of the year, then companies need to stand up for that. What's currently happening in the U.S. is litigation is brought against requirements just like this. So the conflict minerals requirement that was passed through the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and the sister provision, Section 1504, which pertains to payments from extractive issuers to foreign to governments, both were litigated and are currently in litigation. So the American Petroleum Institute brought litigation against the 1504, the publish what you pay provision, and the 1502 provision is also in litigation right now by the Chamber of Commerce. So if the companies are going to stand up and say that they want to report and that they want to practice what they preach in terms of knowing and showing, then they need to do so across their activities, including in the tactics they choose to both lobby governments for these things and in litigation. The last thing I'll mention, Richard, and I know my time is quickly dwindling, is that reporting needs to also address impacts. So risks are one thing, but the impacts are really where companies need to be honest and disclose their activities and the impacts they have on communities. So it's important to consider when developing reporting frameworks that they not just be a risk-based approach, that they actually factor in the impacts that the company has on communities and the daily lives of people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we've got a reasonable amount of time, about 40 minutes. I'll just gauge it in terms of when I bring back the panel, but we want to make it as interactive as possible. Like all the other panels, introduce yourself. If you're from an organisation, what it is. You've got a maximum of 2 minutes, and you're not allowed to read out from a bit of paper. Is there a business that can lead me off? Thank you so much.
Okay. Hi, Vanessa Zimmerman from Rio Tinto. We've included human rights in annual reports for the last couple of years, as well as our Sustainable Development Report. And to decide whether human rights is reported as well as what is included, we have quite a robust internal process, so materiality workshops. We also use our internal human rights working group to decide what should go in. We do some external stakeholder engagement as well, and what I was wondering from the panel is if you have any ideas or examples of innovative ways to engage with external stakeholders to hear what they want to see in reports from a materiality point of view, so whether it's external advisory groups or measures like that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Is there another company or company federation who can contribute next? Please.
My name is Bert Fokkum. I work for Shell. I would like to make a few comments that are not undermining or contradicting anything that was said on the podium in any way. So it would be, in my view, it would be scribbles that you make in the margins of your notes and your speeches maybe, and they probably end with a question mark. But so one of the things I believe, I think is that when it comes to reporting and human rights, I think the guiding principles only talk about reporting once when it is about reporting, and all the other times they talk about communicating. And reporting is only in the cases of the most severe human rights impacts. So when it comes to communicating, there are lots of challenges around engaging local communities about their impacts, which companies I think are well equipped to do and have lots of experience with, but it shouldn't be completely confused with reporting. And I think the target audience for sustainability reports of companies is a completely different audience than the ones who are interested in what their communities are. So those are different things. In APICA, we released yesterday a guidance about impact assessment and human rights and how that can be integrated. And the guide is about twice as long as we originally intended because of all the issues that you have when you communicate and report about human rights. There are a lot of good reasons and transparency reasons, but you also have to protect rights holders from unintended consequences. So that is something that needs to be considered. Then in terms of transparency, I think transparency is really important, and my company has been on reporting and transparency for a long time. But I think transparency is a means, it's not an end. So transparency for the sake of it, I think you will not find companies supporting always. It needs to go somewhere, it needs to serve a purpose. And I think that is where I would like to end.
Very helpful. Two companies in the extractive sector. I'm going to ask one more business to lead us off, who's perhaps a different sector. Are you a different sector from the extractives? Or not? Which sector are you in? Your Federation.
International Relation of Employers.
So I invite you to speak to us, please.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the panel. It was very interesting. I have actually a question to the colleague from the American government with regard to the Dodd-Frank Act. It's about the question about the consequences for the Congo, actually, of this legislation. What we hear from our colleagues in the Congo, we have the Employers Federation, is that it leads this legislation to an art of boycott of the Congo, because American companies cannot be sure that when they buy their minerals, not lead to the conflict or not support the conflict there. So they don't buy there anymore. The fact is, in the Congo itself, that the few formal employment which you have there is going down the river. The conflict is not anyway affected. This goes on. This has no consequence for the conflict. The only what you achieve with this legislation is that you harm formal employment there, which is not big in the Congo anyway. Is there any ideas of the American government how to address it, or is it any kind of consideration process in this regard? And my second question would be also with regard to this act about how it was created. How much of consultations actually you undertook, because I understood this Dodd-Frank is only one part of a much bigger package actually. And as far as I know, but I'm really not an expert on this, it came in the last minute. There was not a lot of consultation in this regard. And isn't it that in this kind of legislation, which is so important, you need a kind of a real process of consultation to make it right in order to avoid these kind of negative consequences of goodwill. Thank you very much.
Would you mind just introducing where you're from?
I said it's the International Organization of Employers. We are an umbrella organization of the National Employers Federation. In the US, for instance, is the US Chamber of Commerce, International Chamber of Commerce, which is part of our members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to look to the civil society sector now, trade unions, NGOs. I'm going to see it as I see it, starting there.
Thank you very much. I'm Franziska Howitt from Oxfam, an international development organization. Thank you very much for your great presentations, which are very interesting. And my question is also addressed to the US government. I think it's very interesting and very excellent that your new law on that reporting obligation for companies investing in Myanmar. And what came immediately to my mind, whether it wouldn't be possible to is that working? Yeah. Whether to expand it a bit to other countries and for other investment in other countries, because I think it's a really good tool to promote corporate accountability. And my second question on that is also how do you enforce it? Is there any enforcement mechanism, or are there any sanctions available for that in order to secure the companies really provide their annual reports? Thank you.
I know the US government doesn't need me to protect it, but you know, it's not just question time to the US government. And Scott, I'm very pleased that you're here. So let's not just ask critical questions of the US government, please. Although all questions, of course, eligible. And if someone has either agrees or disagrees with the point about DR Congo, it would be quite interesting to hear that from the audience. Next to the colleague here.
Thanks. I'm Kathy Mulvey with IRIS Conflict Risk Network, and I do actually have a comment related to the reporting requirements on Burma. And I guess our umbrella network of investors really agrees with the premise here that information on corporate human rights practices and performance is material, particularly in conflict-affected areas. So information such as what companies are doing to mitigate risks and the impacts that they're having. And I guess investors under our umbrella actively engaged in the consultation process with the U.S. government on the development of the Burma reporting requirements. And now we're continuing to engage with companies that are required to report, as well as those that are not required to do so. So I guess the question is, for the panelists, both from the sort of government side as well as the investor and reporting initiative side, how can investors work with governments to raise the bar and so that the standards, so that the highest possible standards become universal on these kinds of disclosures, and that legislative and regulatory mechanisms then get put in place to address issues that can't be covered by transparency, where sunlight isn't enough? Thanks.
Many people describe it as a journey, so I think that's a very good question. Here, please.
Vita de Waal Foundation for Gaia. The guidelines are not only addressed to companies, but also to government, agency, international agencies, and other organizations. But how far is this going? There has been no mention of aid agency and the need to report on human rights as related, for example, to aid, financial or otherwise, or refugees camps. There is therefore a link between the human rights norm and obviously also the humanitarian human rights law. I have not heard of this link before, but this is obviously linked to conflict zones. But what about occupied territories, where there would be a big human rights discrepancy between occupants reporting and occupiers reporting? Another difficult area is the human rights dimension of sanctions, say military sanctions. So there is a link with humanitarian law on many areas. So how does human rights reporting apply to this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had some governments, but are there other governments or governmental representatives or state bodies who want to contribute at this stage? Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Marie Volby. I'm from the Danish Ministry of Business and Growth, and thank you for my friend Andrea to present the Danish legislation. You did it quite well, so thank you. I just wanted to add a comment on the, someone mentioned how about enforcing these requirements on reporting. And in Denmark, the Danish requirements on human rights reporting are enforced as an integrated part on the requirements on financial reporting. So actually the Danish Business Authority will look into the reporting, and there will be administrative consequences, and you can have fines if you're not actually living up to the reporting requirements. So that was just a comment. Thank you.
Any other government or state representatives, perhaps from outside Europe and North America, who might want to contribute? Let's take a first round of responses. I'm going to go in reverse order. We're going to have other contributions, so just very quick responses, a couple of minutes maximum, starting with Amol.
Thanks. I'll take the Congo question because we actually worked on Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank provision. So the provision itself was actually, it wasn't a sort of late-night addition as has been sort of advertised. I think there's a lot of confusion and misinformation about the Congo provision and also its impact on the ground in the Congo. There are conflicting reports. Global Witness is a member of our coalition, full transparency here, but they've done some good reporting on the situation on the ground in the Congo and how the minerals trade has actually, the clean minerals trade is actually increasing as a result of the provision. So I encourage you to look up that report on the Global Witness website. There's also the Enough Project that has been doing work on the ground in the Congo for years. So again, I think both of those websites will have information on the Congo provision.
Thanks. A couple of remarks, and I think Bert's comment well made, that in the guiding principles context, the conversation is about communicating, and within that, the guiding principles say that there should be formal reporting if you have high-risk operations or in a high-risk context. The only caveat I will put on that, of course, is that it doesn't say there should only be reporting in that, and I think what we're seeing is that there are other market drivers. Guiding principles, and what they say is one piece of this, there are other market drivers looking at other constituents of companies and defining from their mandates where reporting comes in. But the other point is really significant as well, because I think it's really important that reporting and this kind of formal reporting is not a panacea. It isn't a solution to all the aspects of transparency. It isn't a solution to all the aspects of communication and all those aspects of stakeholder engagement that need to be happening. One interesting reflection we've been hearing, however, is that better formal reporting can in turn provide material to fuel better conversations and engagement in all the more granular levels of company operations as well. So the one might, in a way, flow into the other, but certainly it's not a panacea and it cannot cover all of these, all of the objectives one will have in this space. Second and quick point on the point raised by Vanessa from Rio Tinto, on the issue of external stakeholders, I don't think I've got any particularly good finite answers to that, but certainly one sees that some companies have really gone into the crowdsourcing angle of this, and the one that can have great benefits in getting breadth of voice, but there's also a risk that you get skewing. In other words, those that are most engaged, which may be for one part of the picture with a particular mandate, traditionally very often environmental, end up with a sense that the most material issues are the environmental issues, which may just be that actually there haven't been the same number of human rights voices coming in. So making sure that there's balance coming in as well as breadth coming in.
And I'm going to as moderator, add one question to each of you, and then Teresa will be next. Teresa, it's very easy to say what should happen and what companies should do. Could you comment about how far companies reporting under the GRI are already including human rights and on that? To Andrea, it was in Target 9A in September in the United Nations, but by the year 2030, right, do you foresee that between now and 2015, when the Sustainable Development Goals are agreed, that your group of friends will be able to successfully lobby within the UN to get support for something a bit more quickly than that? And to Scott, as I sort of rather foreshadowed in my cheeky introduction, you've got some quite strict reporting requirements, But then when we look at overall at things like the Sustainable Development Goals, integrated reporting, do you think the United States might be able to fall in behind those at the international level? Teresa next.
Yes, how many companies are already doing this? I think I said something about it in my presentation, but very roughly so far we are looking at formal sustainability reports, and that's also a response to the question of Bert Fokkema of Shell. Indeed, you have to make a distinction between communication and reporting. And I'm talking about formal reports issued, signed off by CEOs, CFOs, and which are publicly stated and to which a company puts itself accountable to the public. So if you count those in, and the ones that actually follow the GRI guidelines and register them with the GRI, we come to around 2,000 companies that have been doing it so far. But then again, you can make a distinction about those companies that explain that they have a policy on human rights, that they work on risk assessment and due diligence, and those that really talk about breaches and grievances and results. So I think there's a huge variety of quality and quantity within that very broad number.
Can I just press you a bit? Of the 2,000, maybe not a number, but how many of them are addressing human rights within that?
Only human rights?
No, within it. Human rights explicitly part of the reporting.
That's the number I was mentioned. Yes,
right,
in one way or another. Either at the policy level, say they are working on it or they have a policy on it. Others are describing more in detail, what have they done with that policy, what were the results, were there any breaches, and do they have installed grievance mechanism. Those that really go through the whole, you could say the whole spectrum, I think there would be very, very considerably smaller a number of companies.
Thank you, Richard. Just to answer your question, do we think we can lobby and make this happen before what we've said initially? The answer is definitely yes. What do we need? As I said earlier today, what we need is more friends that are committed to do this and that have the political will to engage in the discussions and the changes that are needed for this to happen at the speed it needs to happen. The creation of the group actually responds to a market demand for more and better information, and that we know. But the need for a group that's actually composed by governments responds to the need of doing this at the speed that's required. And that's why we governments want to engage in this subject. We believe that sustainability reporting and corporate reporting will keep happening, but perhaps not at the need at the speed that it should be happening. And that's why we want to come into the picture. And to do so, we're working with governments and international organizations at different levels to make sure that our message gets out there. So we believe it will certainly happen. And may I answer one of the questions that you were asking from Rio Tinto? There is an initiative that perhaps you could look into. The OECD is currently discussing the creation of a new tool on meaningful stakeholder engagement in the extractive sector industry. There are no final answers to that, but you should certainly be part of the debate as they're mapping what's out there and what should be out there that's missing. So that's something you may want to look into.
Thanks, Richard. I think Amol answered the questions about Dodd-Frank, Section 1502. Let me address the questions about the Burma requirements and whether or not they can be expanded. I've gotten that question from several other people over the course of the past few days, and I think our answer would be, in principle, yes. It's still only a little over a year that we've had the Burma requirements in place, and we are only getting the first report. So I think we need to have some more experience under the Burma requirements before we think about going broader. There may be some challenges, too, with legal authority and the like, but in principle, of course, this makes good sense. And I know that the EU and others are looking at more global regimes rather than just country-specific. In terms of the enforceability of the reporting requirements, in the case of the Burma reporting requirements, countries that meet the definition of the requirements and fail to file reports are subject to both civil and criminal penalties if they fail to file a report. That said, if they file a skeletal report, that still meets the requirements. So that's new ground that we're going to have to cover. Our goal, though, here is not a regime, a gotcha regime where we're, out there looking to civilly and criminally punish governments. We're rather interested in starting a conversation with them between the U.S. government and the companies, and publicly as well. And indeed, the first 5 reports that have been filed under these Burma reporting requirements have stimulated a great deal of public commentary already. And our view is that that's a good debate. On the point about making government assistance kind of accountable, or reporting on government assistance, be it for humanitarian purposes or other purposes, I think this is an excellent point. In the U.S., we have a number of country-specific reporting requirements about our assistance that we comply with. Colombia, Honduras come to mind. We also, of course, file our annual country reports on human rights situations globally, although those are not tied to specific assistance efforts. But I think your point is a good one, that assistance with governmental assistance should come some sort of duty to report on whether and how that assistance is impacting on human rights. And lastly, in response to Richard's question about whether or not the U.S. can sign on to broader reporting requirements, I unfortunately come only from the Human Rights Bureau, so if it comes to human rights, I could say, yes, we would be in favor of reporting, but these reporting requirements often involve lots of other equities, and so bringing together all the relevant entities within the U.S. government is sometimes challenging to do to get them to sign up to this. So hopefully in the future, Richard, we can do more, but it's not something that I here can commit to on my own.
There was someone in your country who once said, yes, we can, wasn't there? Yeah. Can't remember who it was. But on the theme of not picking on the states, we all have that in our countries. And we have that certainly in Europe between countries. It's not a unique challenge for your own country. I'm told we've got time for about 5 more questions from the audience. I can certainly see a trade union voice that I'm going to take because we want it to be as broad-based as possible. But I'm going to be insistent on trying to get a business, at least one business first. Are you, yeah?
The chair of the Global Network Initiative, so I can talk for both business and civil society, if I may. My issue on reporting is really perhaps rather a fundamental one. In the area of human rights reporting, we're dealing with very sensitive issues. And so I think what we've been hearing from the panel is what can we tell the public at large and what we're doing in this area. And if you actually want human rights reporting to do a couple of other things as well, namely to drive better behavior in the corporate world on the one hand, and to allow perhaps a selective group of stakeholders to check whether the improvements are actually taking place, which you want to see, then I think you've got to have a different process. And it's interesting that a number of companies are using review panels of sustainability reports. Shell is one of them. Then obviously the Global Reporting Initiative uses a very specific process whereby we actually have independent assessors reviewing the work that the individual companies are doing, reporting to the board, which is a representative group of stakeholders, including the companies, and then with an external report, which in the case of the Global Network Initiative will be out by the end of December, saying what the result is from these independent assessments. So I think it's important to understand that there are, particularly if you want to go into how companies are dealing with particularly problematical cases, if you want to look at some of the more sensitive information, then you've obviously got to go beyond what you can share with the public, and that goes way beyond the kind of criteria which you've been mentioning on the panel. But I think it's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that picks up what Caroline, you said in the introduction about assurance, which I think is an important issue in this area, so thank you for raising it.
We participate. I'm Dwight Justice. I'm with the International Trade Union Confederation. We participate in the Global Reporting Initiative because we believe that the decision on what you report on is another way of deciding what is important. We don't necessarily think that all of this leads to good things, but we think it would be very bad if we were not there when those decisions are made. And so that's why we're there. one of the things that helped us an awful lot in this was the guiding principles, because they helped to shift the focus away from the well-being of the company onto the adverse impacts on society that needed to be addressed by the company. And we still think that is the way that you need to go. And one of the things I wanted just to note here is we're getting very concerned about some of the new reporting instruments that are being developed, because, of course, they're directed at investors. And because they're directed at investors, they're not necessarily going to reflect the kind of things that, for instance, some stakeholders who have absolutely no interest in the success of the company, but nevertheless are adversely affected by the company, need to take into account. And again, it's a question of materiality. And we're not so sure that reputation risk is the only thing that you could say, well, it'll be on reputation risk. So we think that you have to develop a much more sophisticated concept of materiality in reporting than just the needs of the readers, which in most cases are investors. Now, the second thing I just wanted to say, and it's unavoidable, is many of you will know that we were very critical of this proposed project by Shift to develop a reporting and assurance framework or standard. We still are very concerned. Our concerns have not been met, and we're waiting for them to be met, but at one point we'll have to look and reevaluate how we stand. But it's not, please don't think that this is uncontroversial, or that the controversy
just briefly,
is
because we're
over.
run out of time. Just say one key concern that you have, because
well,
I think
look,
it'll help
you
the
set
debate.
standards or guidelines or things in the public domain with either representation or expertise. And we've said that there is no expertise. We think it's a little dubious that the assurance industry provides expertise in this. And then the other thing is, the other way to set standards is representation. And what we do not see there is a rule-based system that has the right people making the decisions and present in the process. That's absent too.
Okay. I wasn't inviting criticism of Shift, but I think it's useful for the debate to understand that, and then that gives you a chance also to respond to it. I saw another hand there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Dante Pesce. I'm from the Center for Social Responsibility based in Chile. I just want to point out on the trend in public policy and reporting in the Latin American and Caribbean region. In January this year, 33 heads of states, all the presidents of our region, signed a commitment to develop national action plans on CSR, and also to push a local agenda in each country into transparency and accountability for mostly large companies, in line with paragraph 47 of Rio Plus 20, specifically pointed out environment, labor, and human rights. And there's going to be a conference, a joint conference between EU and Latin America and Caribbean in next April or May 2015, in which all the heads of states are going to be asked to report back on the outcome of the action plans, if there are action plans, and the outcome on the reporting side. In my own country, Chile, we have a council for public policy on CSR-related issues, which includes unions and civil society organizations. And an agreement was proposed to the government and was approved by the Council of Ministers to move into report for state-owned enterprises, following the Swedish model, and report or explain for large companies, especially the ones on the stock exchange, following the Danish model. But that is just a case of a country. But actually what I want to highlight is that 33 countries, all of the countries, signed by their presidents, committed to do that and to actually be accountable to that commitment in the next Leaders Summit of Latin America and European Union.
And can I just say I welcome that. I very much welcome that Chile as part of the Friends of 47 group. We had a brilliant summit, Latin America, European Union, I think 3 years ago now, on these issues, and I welcome the commitment to a further one. And because you're going to get 33 out of 33 and we've only got 22 out of 28, you'll definitely win. You definitely win. Right. Last one, someone? Right over here.
Hi, my name is Marcia Narayan. I'm a law professor in Miami. I have a quick question and a comment. Given the fact that there's so many disclosure regimes, I'm wondering what the panel thinks would be the most impactful on indigenous peoples and communities, whether that's something that might relate to timber or right to water or something like that. So I just want your thoughts on that from the panel, or whether it's a global disclosure regime. And then a comment for those of you that are interested. You may not have seen this. It's a report that came out from OCO Institute in August of 2013 that was done for the European Commission on basically everything that had been looked at by Dodd-Frank, every amicus brief, everything by Enough. And I think it's part of the reason that the European Commission has put off its legislation on conflict minerals until next year. It took a very critical look at pretty much everything that's come out, so that might be something that I recommend that some of you all look at if you haven't had a chance to look at it.
It's fair to say that there is an absolute commitment to publish that legislation that is, I can say is certainly complementary to what our United States friends have done. December was the last time I heard as the target date for publishing it. But of course we should all learn lessons. Right, I'm going to invite final comments again, 2 minutes each. I'm going to return to the order that we started with and invite Scott to address us.
Thanks, Richard. I don't have much to say in response to these last round of comments, other than I wasn't aware of the commitment by the 33 leaders in the Western Hemisphere on this, and we'll have to see whether the United States maybe should join that group.
It's everyone in the Americas except Canada and the U.S. belongs to the group.
Okay, well that's
They really don't like you, do they? They really don't.
And I think the question on indigenous communities is a quite interesting one, and I know this has been talked about elsewhere, but the World Bank, as many people know, is looking at its own safeguards, which already do to some extent take account of the impact of their lending on indigenous communities. But I think the notion of looking specifically about what indicators would be useful for identifying problems with indigenous communities is a worthwhile one, and I'll take that back as well. Thank you.
Andrea.
Thank you, Richard. Just to reiterate what I said earlier before, the group of friends is new, but is looking for more friends. And the invitation to all of you is, if your government is not part of our group, do research, learn about us, and lobby your government. And if your government approaches, we'll be here. I think in the afterwards of this panel, Marianne, our president, will be here. We are happy to answer questions, and hopefully we can engage more and more countries into making sustainability reporting a top priority in terms of public policy. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't want to accentuate that. You don't have to become a friend and attend all the meetings and so on to support what they're trying to achieve. If they're successful, that means that you don't have to do that. You just have to support it in the UN. I'm an entirely neutral, independent, objective chair, of course, just to make that very, very clear. Teresa.
I think there were still a few from the floor that were not responded to by the panel. One of them is the what about reporting by public agencies, governments, UN agencies? I think it's an important question. I regret that we couldn't tackle it. I would say that there are some countries, Germany for instance, they have just gone through the whole round of issuing a GRI sustainability report from the Ministry of Employment and Social Affairs, and Denmark is now looking at, the difficult task for a government to go through the motions to say, well, let's practice what we preach to the companies, and let's ourselves as a government also be transparent. So I think there are some processes cooking, but I think it's an important question. But last but not least, I think I would like to say that we have the tools. We need more convergence between the tools. We need a critical mass of companies who actually continue to travel this journey and to listen to each other. And I'm looking forward to see the results of that next year. Thank you.
And do you mind if I just press you again, Teresa? Dwight's point, this is all just for investors, and there are significant concerns about that in civil society. How do you respond to that?
Well, I absolutely agree, because this is this is in the end about public accountability, and it is in the end about transparency. And these processes that I think in a way the UN Guiding Principles is an example of that. These have been negotiated going through input from governments, from business, from civil society, from the labor union. So I think that is why it has such a huge buy-in, and it was a very, very long process that preceded with somebody like Mary Robinson bringing together a lot of companies, and then it came into the intergovernmental process. So these are things that have to be owned and that have to be negotiated, going through this what you call rule base, with and through which the decision-making process is clear and important. And I also agree very much with that. Who would be the ultimate users and of this information? Of course, investors are important, but in the end, it's the general public. It's us who vote and who buy as consumers and voters, etc. Which does not mean that we should not look very enthusiastically at new initiatives, new expertise that pops up, and that brings a new expertise to the table. And that's exactly the reason why we said to Shift, let's work together and see how we can learn from each other, also on process, also on ownership. Thank you.
And I would just add the Global Reporting Coalition of Investors, 77 investors, were one of the most active groups in Rio, arguing for mandatory reporting by businesses. So there isn't necessarily a conflict, although, of course, there are different views in the room, and I respect that. Did you want to just add a point on that?
Not exactly on that, but on public agency reporting, I think it's very important what you asked. And I wanted to share with all of you that that's certainly a priority in Colombia, since we want to lead by example. And we've launched a pilot to have all of the trade sector public agencies to release their sustainability reports. It's been quite a challenge, let me tell you, to actually make our employees believe that not because we have a constitutional mission, we're necessarily a sustainable organization. And that's been a challenge, but it's working. And we also have the pleasure to share with you that our Army is going to release its first sustainability report as well. So that will be something interesting for everyone to read, and especially for me. But they're all using the GRI framework. And it's been interesting. The Export Credits Agency just released its report, and there are 3 more public agencies coming up. With that, we hope to make it work so that we can ask other sectors to do the same within the government.
Carolyn. There's a delay on it. Yeah, it's you next. Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, thank you for passing that over. Dwight, I would have been concerned if you hadn't raised your concerns. So thank you for putting those into the room, because they've been an important part of the debate. And I mean, you were present at our consultation in London, and we've had, I'm pleased to say as well, good trade union representation in other consultations as well. And I mean, the points you raise are ones on which we hear different perspectives, but I don't say that in order to reduce the relevance of the point that you raise. And let me just make a couple of remarks. With regard to the assurance industry providing expertise, and what you mean by that is our project partner Mazar in this engagement. As I indicated in my remarks, in order to just work through the array of issues that arise and start to crystallize what are the issues that are needed for discussion, we need expertise. And Mazar provide that expertise. Now, as I said also, and I think they will be the first to say, there are many others in their field and in other fields who provide that. So it's we've had all manner of other auditors, assurance providers in the discussion as well. And this is not a proprietary proposition, but it is one where we need and we benefit from that expertise. One point that you, and not only you, have raised in consultations is also the importance, as we look at 2 frameworks, that, as it were, if I can put it that way, the tail not wag the dog. In other words, that we not look at what meaningful reporting is in terms of what it is easy to assure. And that's, I think, something that's really resonated as we look at this proposition. And I can certainly say within the project team, the interest here is in re-envisioning and reimagining, not in replicating and duplicating precedents, learning from and building on, but not simply replicating. But having the tail not wag the dog is a very crucial point. I'll also say that a really clear message out of the ASEAN region across stakeholders, including all civil society stakeholders, was the importance of assurance. And what they were reflecting was working in an environment where there is relatively little trust also in some of the regulatory drivers in this field. They put great weight on the process of assurance and are interested in seeing that go forward. So, there are a number of factors in play there. Your governance and rule-based decision-making point I need to address as well. Look, it's been an important point to raise, and I think it's very clear that if you're developing legal standards, you have to have that kind of governance. If you are developing codes that members are obliged to abide by, you need that kind of governance. And it's something that can play a role in other contexts. There are also many different ways of developing guidance and frameworks of this kind in this field that drive other kinds of process. And I think ultimately what we're saying in this, and we've also had very divergent views on this point, is judge it on the product. We don't know where the product's going to go. We hope it will be a good one, but it will be judged on that because there's no mandatory authority behind this. It is on the merits of the output.
Thanks. Okay. Thank you. So a couple quick points to sum up because I think we're all tired. It's been a long forum. First, reporting exists in many different ways. Okay, so I think one of the things that we are advocating for at ICAR is for governments to look at the various ways that reporting can happen. So on the one hand, we have the securities regime. On the other hand, we could think about sanctions regime. And the Burma reporting requirements are actually from the easement of sanctions that the reporting attachment, the attachment to report came in. You could think about customs and border as a way to increase reporting on human rights related issues. So there's diversity in the types of reporting that could happen. And I think as advocates and as folks concerned about these issues, we need to think about the right lever to pull depending on the harm we're trying to address. The second point I want to make is that there are lessons already out there that we can learn from. The Conflict Minerals Rulemaking, Section 1502, includes a reference to a 5-step OECD process that is a robust human rights due diligence process. That process was multi-stakeholder in its development. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We can take lessons learned that are already in law and apply them to different contexts. And with that, I thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a few concluding remarks. I think we found out that reporting is not a panacea. It's also not the same as communicating, and that's been a useful distinction. We've seen a lot of companies are already doing it on human rights. This is not starting from zero. 2,000 plus. I didn't understand that, which is why I asked you to clarify it. 2,000 plus using the GRI to report on human rights already. 76% of top companies in France already. And I know Teresa wanted to talk, we ran out of time, about India. We've also heard today, although there are divergent views, and there's nothing wrong with divergent views, that's obviously part of what we want to understand and to encourage. But in DR Congo, we've certainly heard a view that the clean minerals trade is expanding and improving because of the legislation from the States. We do love the United States, Scott, and you are a crucial partner to us. What you said about, at least from the human rights point of view, supporting this emerging international governance in this area is very welcome. And I'm sure you take the messages back from us. And to Andrea in Colombia, when you say we definitely can get a commitment out of 2015, that's a very strong statement. And you have many of our support in the Friends Group in order to achieve that. You talk, Caroline, about crowdsourcing. There are between 17 and 1,800 people here. Thank you to the businesses who took up my invitation to come first. And I personally want to just place on record, I think it's terribly important that you are able to fully participate in this forum. And I've been anxious about that, and I've tried to put that right in this session, and I'm going to be taking that message back as well, because we can't do this without you. 1,700 to 1,800 people overall, but if we're talking crowdsourcing, we've worked out that in the last 2 days, this forum has been followed on the web by 349,500 more people. And that makes the point about transparency and accountability in this world of ours. It is unstoppable. Teresa was right. It's unstoppable. And it's the way that we need to move on. Thank you to the translators. The next session is room 20. Thank you to all my fellow speakers. Can I just say, in thanking you, not only do we have the best looking panel, we have the best looking audience as well. Thank you very much.